I'm sure if we left right now, we could say that our time together has already been very, very beneficial in the wholesome thoughts we've had and the really good effort put forth in worshiping God. But we're not leaving yet. I have a few thoughts I want to share with you that I hope will enhance all the good things that have already taken place this evening. And I'm glad we have quite a few young people here. I should have announced this morning, but I didn't. But I'm glad that we still have a lot of young people here, because tonight's lesson, I've entitled it, Lessons I Learned About My PowerPoint Presentation. Here we go. But I'll do this one too. Lessons I learned from a teenager, namely about serving God. Now, at first, you might think that it would be a lesson that I learned as a teenager or from being a teenager. But that's not where I'm going with this. I want us to consider lessons to be learned from a teenager about serving God. Now, sometimes that will be a contradiction because we make so many mistakes in our youth. We do things that, as we get older, we can't even look back on and think about without cringing because of the folly and the foolishness and the vanity and the imprudence of certain decisions we may have made in the past. And most people can relate to that. But the Bible tells us of a teenager who had already exemplified grand character, stellar character, and faith in God. And there are quite a few young people mentioned in the Bible. And this particular person is noted as a shepherd. He is of the family. He was a literal descendant of Abraham physically. And like I said, by the age of 17, the Bible tells us about this man's good character. And I'm sure there are quite a few people who could probably fit the bill on these details, but the person I'm referring to is Joseph, who was the great-grandson of Abraham. You had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Jacob had many sons, and one of them was Joseph. And the Bible tells us, in picking up with this man's life, Joseph that is, that he was 17 in Genesis chapter 37 and verse 2, when the story begins to look at his life. And there are so many good things this guy did. One of my favorite Christians that I've known in life said that one of his favorite characters in the Bible was Joseph, that it had a tremendous influence on the kind of person he was throughout life. And I would think the same could be said of many of us, that we've looked at examples like Joseph in the Bible and have been impressed very profoundly by this person. But we sometimes forget he was a teenager. He was a teenager when he began to illustrate and demonstrate so many of these wonderful principles that certainly shaped his life and can shape our life as well in living for God. I just want to pick up on three of those in looking at this thought with you. When I look at this teenager, he shows me the importance of, number one, always doing your best no matter the circumstance. And that's a lesson that, as a 50-something-year-old, I still need to hear, and I can still benefit from. But we see that in this man's life that he was able to portray this in the midst of some severe betrayal. It talks about in Genesis chapter 37, and picking up in this man's life, that one of the things that added to his problems was the fact that his father had shown favoritism among the kids. Okay, let me see, it didn't sound like it was on. But in Genesis chapter 37, it says in verse 3 beginning that Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. He also made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaf stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brother said to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now, we could probably see, that maybe he didn't have the best of choices in the words he used, especially with people who didn't like him. But he was just telling the truth. I think he was all innocent and sincere at this point. But we see that this is what he was up against. His family hated him. Like I said, the catalyst to that was the fact that the father was showing favoritism. That's a good point right there. That if we want to pit our children against one another, one thing we can do is show favoritism. And so we have to have that equal love, that agape love that Todd told us about, and that's right. But we see that his brothers did not have that for him, and it festered to the point that they were willing to try and kill him at one point. In chapter 37, it says in verse 23, "It came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And they sat down to eat a meal. Then they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, 'What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh.' And the brothers listened. Then Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt." We know the story, but what we can see from this is what this guy was up against. Okay, he was up against some intense hatred. I mean, these guys couldn't even look at him. And they had discussed the possibility of killing him, and then of Judah, of course, says, "What's the value? Why should we do that? Why should we engage in anything like that?" I see a lot of fans going, "Can we get some air in here? Is that possible? Have I gone too far? Should I not have said that?" But it's possible. I don't know. Maybe it's just so hot outside. Maybe that's the problem. But I see a lot of you fanning. But we see with Joseph that he was up against some major hatred. But here's the thing. Here's the point I want to get at when we look at him, is that even though he was betrayed by his family, he still continued to do his best even when he was sold into slavery. Now think about that for a second, because we read that in Genesis chapter 39. Think about it. How could he have responded to this? I mean, here he is, a young man. He could have easily done what? He could have easily become bitter. He could have easily become violent. He could have easily become resentful. He could have easily blamed God. He could have. Because he was betrayed by his flesh and blood. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was taken away from his father for the foreseeable future. And yet we see in Genesis 39 that even though he was betrayed into slavery, he was the best slave he could be. In Genesis chapter 39 and verse 1, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had, he put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Okay, this is the thing that impresses me about him. Like I said, he could have easily become resentful. He could have easily become violent and bitter in these circumstances, rebellious. But instead, he demonstrated good character. I'm a slave, all right? That's not the hand I want. That's not what I prefer, but it's the one that's been dealt to me. I'm going to be the best slave there is. I'm going to be such a slave that my master's going to trust me. And so he was a person who could be trusted, who was doing his job very well, honorably, to the point that he became the chief slave, the most trusted person in the household. And that, of course, is a very important lesson to learn. I thought about this and wondered, where did he learn that? Again, a very young person, where did he learn to be so responsible and trustworthy and to do the right thing even when no one was looking? Where did he learn that? And I would think that stemmed from his experiences as a shepherd. That as a shepherd, that was a big responsibility, and you had to be a person who did the right thing. Even when no one else was around, you had to do the right thing because the right thing needed to be done. So maybe in the fields, he learned to be honorable and of that kind of character. Wherever he learned it, he's applying it on foreign soil in the household of a person who just bought him as a slave. Again, he could have easily become bitter, but instead, he became the best version of Joseph as a slave. And that impresses me. That's a lesson I need to be reminded of. We need to remember that one way that we honor God is by working and then to do our job very, very well. Now, our nation is at a critical time because you see so many places that are looking for people to work. Now hiring is all over the place. And not only is it now hiring, you have people who will not do their job or will not keep a job. That's a big problem we see in our society. And there are people who are thinking that the government's going to bail them out, or the government's going to provide for them long term. And this is the way some are thinking. And it's not a very good thing. I had somebody tell me that he asked one of the panhandlers here in town. You know, you see these guys on the street begging for money. And it's odd because right behind them is a business that has on the marquee, now hiring. I saw one guy doing that, and I mean literally right behind him was a restaurant that said, we will give you a $100 signing bonus if you work. Right behind him as he is asking people for money. It's bizarre. But my friend told me that he asked one of them recently, why are you asking for money when you have all these places looking for workers? And he said that he can make between $600 and $800 a day doing that. So why should he work? And that's terrible, really, to think like that. Now, I don't think he's making anything. He may be getting, but he's not making. That's not work. That's not gainful employment. But it's a bad trend. It's a horrible trend for people to think that they should not work to provide for themselves when there is a need. Now, keep in mind, there's a difference between not being able to find a job or find the right job versus not working. And the point I want us to see is Joseph shows us the importance of doing our best, whatever it might be. In Ephesians chapter 4, the Bible says that we honor God by working to provide for ourselves. In verse 28, Ephesians 4, not saying we can't receive charity or we don't need charity at times. I understand that. But this is talking about willing to provide for ourselves when we can. It says in verse 28, let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good, that he may have something to give him who has need. So it's God's will for us to work, and to work very well. In Ephesians chapter 6, notice how he told the slaves. Now, this is centuries after Joseph, and yet we see Joseph demonstrated this very well. In Ephesians chapter 6, it says in verse 5, "Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters, according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ, not with eye service." That is, don't just work when the boss is around, or don't just work when the manager's around. You work out of integrity and character. And so he says, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with goodwill, doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. So whatever you do it all to the glory of God. You do the best you can. You be the best version of yourself. And Joseph, of course, is a wonderful example of that. But I keep going with this man, this young man, this teenager, who shows me, number two, the importance of staying sexually pure. And this is a major aspect of his story, because it says in Genesis chapter 39 that as he is the most trusted person in the household, as the chief slave, we might say, we see that the master's wife was attracted to him. In Genesis chapter 39, it says in verse 6 that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." Now, from what I understand, the Egyptian women were known for being promiscuous. That's what was noted. And we can see that somewhat in this lady's attitude. In verse 8, he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" That is legendary. What a deep perspective to have. A teenager. And his attitude is, look, I'm trusted with everything. I can have anything in this house, but I can't have you. Your husband won't let me. And I'm not going to do that because my God won't let me. What kind of perspective is that? What kind of outlook is that? That's why I like this idea of decision making as a study for the teenagers. That's a good thought. This is the kind of stuff that we all need to learn. But we see from him, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do it because I don't want to injure my God. And so I'm not going to yield to this. And come on. The guy is in his late teens. He's at the peak of his desires. And here's this woman who is saying things to entice him, and his response is, "I want no business with this. I am not going to be sexually impure." What a tremendous, tremendous example. And what we see in looking at him, that she did not let up. It says in verse 10, "So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day." Okay, so it wasn't just one time. This woman was continually looking for opportunity to be with him. And so he had opportunity after opportunity to commit this sin, to lie with her and to be with her. But it happened about this time in verse 11 when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside, that she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. Great opportunity. Nobody's going to know. It's just one-on-one. We can keep it a secret. And the man, the young man, fled. He ran. I'm not going to commit adultery. Now, I don't know. I don't know how this could possibly be portrayed in your life, but it's going to be. It may be a literal person in your life who is trying to use you. Young women, there are guys that will use you to satisfy their desires. And young men, you need to know there are women who will use you to satisfy their desires. and their pride. It'll happen. And it will happen day by day, in a sense, throughout your life, where you will have opportunity to be immoral. Here's what I've come to learn. Potiphar's wife comes into our lives every day. She shows up every day. She shows up on our phones, on our devices, on our computers. She's everywhere. She is constantly enticing God's people to lay with her, to engage in sexual immorality with her. That's the world we live in, and it is deep. It is rampant. Potiphar's wife is everywhere. And what Joseph, the teenager, should show us is it is possible, even at a young age, to respect God and to have enough sense and wisdom that I'm not going to take this path of immorality because of the trouble it will bring and because of the division it will bring in my relationship with God. That's what Proverbs is saying. Proverbs is begging young people to listen. That's what wisdom is doing. Wisdom is begging you to listen. And one thing that wisdom is saying is don't take the path of sexual immorality. It's going to break your heart, and it's going to bring trouble into your life. In Proverbs chapter 6, notice where God is saying this, and God is pleading. This is really God himself saying this, but he personifies it with wisdom and a father speaking to his son. But it says in Proverbs chapter 6, in verse 20, beginning, "My son, keep your father's command, and do not forsake the law of your mother. Bind them continually upon your heart. Tie them around your neck. When you roam, they will lead you. When you sleep, they will keep you. And when you awake, they will speak with you. For the commandment is a lamp, and the law a light. Reproofs of instruction are the way of life, to keep you from the evil woman, from the flattering tongue of a seductress. Do not lust after her beauty in your heart, nor let her allure you with her eyelids. For by means of a harlot a man is reduced to a crust of bread, and an adulteress will prey upon his precious life." You're going to have opportunity. It's going to come. There are people who are going to be attracted to you, and that they're going to want to take advantage of you. What will you do? How will you respond to that? Joseph shows us the wise path to take. Not only in avoiding trouble in this life. You know, the Bible says it this way in Hebrews chapter 13, that you and I should avoid adultery and fornication in addition to all the reasons we just looked at, because it can wreck your life. It can reduce you to a crust of bread. What do you think that means? That adultery will reduce you to a crust of bread. That's just simply saying all your potential is just wiped out. You are devalued. When you lose your honor, your respect, when people don't trust you, your life has just been devalued. And so he's saying, why go through that? Not only for those reasons, but notice what God says in Hebrews chapter 13 and in verse 4. God says something else about fornication and adultery. And his message is that he is going to judge everybody who lays with Potiphar's wife. If you give in to this woman, I'm going to judge you for it, is what God says. And here's how he words it. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, that marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. So who do you want? Do you want Potiphar's wife's approval and those desires acted upon for a season? Or do you want God's approval? Because God says you can't have both. And if you give in to this woman, I will judge you for that. Well, what does that mean? The last verse of chapter 12 says, our God is a consuming fire. Now, this shouldn't be too hard for us to appreciate this time of year. It is hot. I mean, it's muggy. I was walking across the parking lot this afternoon about 3 o'clock, the hottest part of the day. And, the newly sealed parking lot and the cracks that were sealed with tar recently, and I could just feel it move. It was almost liquid. It was just so hot. And there are places in our nation that are facing some intense heat. I mean, 20 to 30 degrees hotter than what you and I are facing today. I mean, there are places in our nation and even in the world where you have trash cans, mailboxes, signs melting from the heat. So we can see examples of what heat does. What heat does. What does God say? God says that He is a consuming fire. What will happen if we are people who yield to fornication and adultery? God says, I'm going to judge you for that. And that's a severe judgment. And so there is more than one reason for you and I to remain sexually pure, especially how can I do this to God? How can I sin against Him? Let me say one last thing, if I may, because this is a very important point as well. He didn't do this as a teenager, but I think he got a running start on it from being a teenager and what he did as a teen. And that is, I see from this young man the important principle of waiting on the Lord. So he is sold into slavery, and the boss's wife betrays him, so he's thrown into prison. And in prison, we see that he continued to stay true to form, in that he would be now the best prisoner he could be. That's such a good lesson to learn from this guy. Whatever you're in, any circumstance, whether you deserve it or not, do your best. You know, the Bible says that a man who excels in his work will stand before kings. Proverbs 22:29 says that. It doesn't matter what work it is. Whether you're a plumber, whether you're a musician, whether you're a baker, whatever it is, if you excel in your work, you're going to stand out when you do a really good job with integrity. Joseph excelled in his work as a slave and now as a prisoner. And what do you know? In Genesis chapter 39, it says in verse 21, beginning, that the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. That's the value of integrity right there. That's the value of keeping a good conscience and walking with faith in God. But what we see is he continued to do his best. And because he did that, it presented opportunity. And one of those opportunities was when he was given the chance to explain to Pharaoh, the top guy in Egypt, why he was having the dreams he was having. In chapter 41 of Genesis, it says that Pharaoh was having some nightmares. And one of the persons who had been in prison with Joseph remembered Joseph and how he had foretold the future before. And it says in verse 8 of Genesis chapter 41, it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. And so we see Joseph was brought in. And Joseph said in verse 16, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." And so he did that. He explained why the king was having this dream about these 7 healthy cows being swallowed up with 7 gaunt, ugly cows. And then why 7 full stalks of grain were being swallowed up by 7 lean stalks of grain. And Joseph explained that to the king in foretelling of the famine that was coming. It says in chapter 41, in verses 37 through 45, that the Lord rewarded Joseph for his faith. It says the king heard this in verse 37, that the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I've set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And he clothed him in in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And he had him ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried out before him, Bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as a wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Tremendous story. But as I look at that story, because now he is second in command in this great nation, dominant nation. But would he have been in that spot had he been a person who became bitter when he was sold into slavery? Would he have been in this spot or this position had he yielded to Potiphar's wife? Or had he became a person who was violent in prison and even more bitter and resentful for how life was mistreating him? You see, because he was a man of character and faith, the Lord rewarded him. Because he walked with God, God walked with him, and he found great success. Let me say this, please. Young people, you're going to have to make a decision whether or not you're going to believe that your life on earth is because of someone greater than you with wisdom, power, and might, or if you're going to attribute that to chance. But here's what the Bible is trying to get you to see. That if you want a life of any hope of prosperity, it is not on your own self or with your own wisdom or the wisdom of other people. It is only through God. And that's what the Bible is saying, that here's the person who's going to find success in life. In Psalm 1, the Bible says in verses 1 through 3, Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, and you're going to have plenty of opportunity for that, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. When's the last time you've done that? When is the last time you have taken God's word and studied it for yourself? Not for Bible class, not for church, but for you and God. What God is saying is, if you're going to walk with me, this is how you do it. And if you do this, and if you trust me and don't trust in yourselves, it says in verse 3, He shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water that brings forth its fruit in season, whose leaf also shall not wither, and whatever he does shall prosper. And Joseph is a living example of that. That if we want true success, it is only through waiting on the Lord. And so I share these beautiful thoughts with you. I am so grateful that God included this young man's example that can teach an old guy like me how to live for God. Do your best in any circumstance. Strive to keep sexually pure, and by all means wait on the Lord. Thank you, friends, for listening. It could be that you're here and you're not a child of God. We hope that you will consider your relationship with God, and if you need to obey the gospel, we have all things to help you do that tonight. Or it could be you need the prayers of the saints here. That's important too, and that's available as well. So if you're subject to the Lord's invitation, please come to Him as we stand and sing.